Today, we become legends.
Farming, macro game, builds, and god knowledge are all extremely important aspects of Smite, but it all ultimately comes down to those all-important team fights. Win those and you win the game. While you can't always rely on your 0-13 Neath jungle to do their job, this guide should at least help you do your job a little better in terms of those big team clashes. I'll be covering a general overview of each conquest role's job in a team fight, what you should be doing, as well as a few specific tips to help you improve your game. For the purpose of simplicity, I'll be assuming you're playing the role in question as it usually is. If you're playing a full damage mage solo, you're not going to play like a frontliner, but for this guide, I'll assume you are. Okay, let's jump in with the first role, that being solo lane. So at a high level, the solo laner's job in team fights is a mix of creating space, locking down enemies, and dealing threatening levels of damage. Creating space is the most underrated but important aspect of being a solo laner in team fights. You have the unique position of being tanky while also dealing enough damage and CC to actually threaten a backliner. This means that in a balanced game, backliners should be scared of you running at them. You can use this to create space for your team by not necessarily full committing onto someone, but threatening to do so as often as possible while staying relatively safe. The difference for backliners between having a solo laner that creates space and one that doesn't is absolutely enormous in keeping at least the enemy's backline pressure off of your backline. Your job as the solo is not really to peel off the enemy solo and jungle from your own backline, that's the support's job, but if you create plenty of space and control where the enemy backline can move by threatening damage or CC, it makes your own backline and support's job much easier. It's also worth noting that a solo laner doesn't necessarily have to be diving in 100 to zeroing the enemy backline. You can do that sometimes, especially if you're fed, have a good matchup into them, catch them sleeping or out of position, etc. But just taking a backliner to half health or CCing them almost takes them out of commission on its own, given your jungler will be an immediate threat to clean up that kill so long as they stick around. Speaking of the jungler, these two roles go hand in hand, and while I will go into more depth on what the jungler should be doing in the next section, a good general rule is that the solo engages the fight onto the backline and the jungle follows up on that. If you're not being the fight starter as the solo laner, it puts a lot of extra pressure on your jungler to initiate, or even your backliners or support to step up and try and initiate, which puts them in a vulnerable position. In terms of specific tips for solo laners, a big one I would recommend is to pay more attention to your team's positioning. It is the solo lane, but in team fights you are not playing solo, and paying attention to when your jungler or even your backliner sometimes are in a position to follow up on your engage will lead to more successful dives, and less of that awful feeling when you dive the backline and your team aren't there to follow up, so you just get shredded and die. Specifically, paying attention to your own jungler is key here, as solo laners often don't have enough damage to straight up solo backliners in the late game, but the jungler doesn't have enough tankiness and or CC to dive in on their own. Utilizing the synergy between these two roles is key, and they really go hand in hand when successfully diving the backline. Alright, since we talked so much about junglers already, let's move on to them next. The jungler's job in a team fight really is that of an assassin. Your job at a high level is to assassinate the enemy backliners, which you almost always have a favorable matchup into 1v1 due to assassins being the best duelists in the game. In team fights as the jungler, you're pretty much looking for that one opening to get into the backline. Patience is key here, as you can't just go diving into both backliners and the support and expect to not get peeled and instantly die. That opening often comes from your solo laner starting the fight with a big CC or damage to allow you to swoop in and clean house. However, that opening can also come from paying careful attention to the positioning of the enemy backliners and punishing them hard if they step too far up or split from their support. Wards are important for every role, but especially in team fights for junglers, knowing where the enemy backline are and having vision on them can be really important, so definitely pick up a couple of wards late game for jungle. In terms of specific tips, tracking relic cooldowns is extremely important for the jungler as well, and if you want to get really good, that's the first place to start. Even if it's just a rough estimate to start with, knowing that the enemy backliner has no beads and or no Aegis makes your job 10 times easier as the jungler. Even with these relics, a good jungler can make light work of a backliner, but without them, they're free food for your burst damage output and mobility. As mentioned before, patience is a virtue in the jungle role. You'll often spend good portions of a fight standing around looking for that opportunity to blow the backline wide open. It's tempting to get antsy and just go for an engage or start throwing out poke, but you'll have more success waiting for the right moment when you can catch someone isolated, or being a follow-up engager after the team fight has already been started by your solo laner or by the enemy team. Assassins do their best work when the enemy can't see or predict you coming, so often waiting for the chaos to ensue first is better than trying to start the fight yourself. It is still sometimes good to engage depending on your pick and the positioning of enemies, but be careful with just fully engaging onto both backliners and the support. It's a very easy way to get peeled, CC'd, and sent straight back to the fountain. We've talked a lot about backline already, but now let's move on to some actual backliners, starting with the mid. The mid is the high burst damage nuker of the team, and like the other backliner in the ADC, walks a constant tightrope in teamfights. You've got to be playing safe enough to not fall to the enemy jungle and solos dive, but risky enough that you can still hit enemies within your effective range. The mid, more so than the ADC, is also looking to throw abilities into the enemy backline where possible, since that's where they'll do their best work. They're also great at nuking overzealous junglers that try to go in at the wrong time. The mid laner's mortal enemy, however, is the solo laner. Due to their tankiness, they can often easily survive a full rotation of your kit, at which point they can get on you and you're gonna have a bad time. So positioning near your support and keeping an eye on where the enemy solo laner is, often with the use of wards, will be crucial for a mid success in teamfights. In terms of specific tips for mid, the biggest one is sort of nebulous, but try to play at your maximum effective range as much as possible in order to maximize safety and return. Go too far up, you get nuked. Stand too far back and you watch the whole fight unfold without being able to land an ability. This is of course different for different gods. Thoth will find this very easy to do, but Nuwa will have a harder time with it. But if you know your god to a decent level, you should know your rough effective range. Try to stay within that without overextending. Again, I know this is sort of useless advice to a certain extent, but try to focus solely on this for a few matches and eventually it will become second nature and you won't be overextending or playing too far back quite as much. Another specific tip for mid is be ready to peel for your ADC. The same goes for ADC when we get there, but backliners peeling for each other is a crucial aspect to teamfighting that almost every backliner I see overlooks dramatically. Sure, your support is there to be the main peeler for the team, but they only have so many cooldowns and or might be diving or otherwise preoccupied at the time, so always being ready to work with your ADC and peel for them is crucial. Sure, a jungler diving you 1v1 is a winning scenario for the jungler 90% of the time, but when your backliners are playing off each other, it turns that 1v1 into a 2v1 and can turn fights on their head enormously. Speaking of the ADC though, let's move on to them. The ADC in teamfights is arguably the most important player. They are the sustained DPS yin to the mid's burst damage yang. Where mid laners typically do better at nuking the jungler but fall to solo laners, ADCs actually do better against the solo laner because of their sustained DPS and high penetration on basic attacks. But the jungler has an even larger advantage against the ADC because they lack the immediate burst damage nuke of the mid that they can easily destroy the jungler with. Often the jungler can get onto the ADC and kill them before they can get enough damage off in time. Shredding the tanks is crucial for the ADC in teamfights as they're by far the most equipped to do so. Don't be afraid to hold your ground against a solo laner diving you. You win that 1v1 most of the time. As always for this video, I'm talking about a normal scenario where no one is particularly fed and fairly normal picks are on the board. Of course, you probably don't win the 1v1 against a fed Bologna diving you, but you get my point. If tanks are getting too antsy and in your face, punish them for it. Even if you just throw out a few autos to poke and push them back, that's winning for you. Your role is literally built to demolish them. In terms of specifics, as mentioned in the mid section, do not neglect working with and peeling for your mid. Due to the inherent nature of Smite's team fights, the divers are usually fighting a 2v3 while the backliners are usually fighting a 3v2. This can change depending on what the support is doing and their pick, but for the most part this is how it works, and it makes the job of the divers really hard if you truly work with your team and your other backliner and the support. If you see the enemy solo about to dive in, be ready to follow up on your mid or support CC to completely shred them before they can even get their engage off. Also, as the ADC in teamfights, you're kind of the MVP. I don't say this to boost ADC mains' egos more than they already are. I say it because having an ADC alive after a winning teamfight versus not having one is a massive difference in what you can do after that teamfight is done with. A lot of the time, a fire giant or even a push for the end hangs in the balance on whether your ADC died or not. So in general, don't overly risk your life for like random 1v1 trades, or god forbid risk your life for nothing. If a teamfight is winding down, don't go chasing out the low health jungler and running into the rest of the team. Even if you get that kill, it severely hurts your team's prospects of actually doing something useful off of that teamfight win. I'm not saying just stand back and watch the fight from 100 meters away, but don't throw your life away just for one kill in trade. Your role post teamfight is too important to be doing that kind of stuff. Alright, and finally, let's talk about the support, who probably has the hardest job in teamfights as they don't necessarily have one specific thing they should be doing. Supports in general will try to strike a balance between backline peeling for their mid and ADC and diving alongside the solo and jungle to provide extra lockdown. Knowing when to do which is extremely difficult and is different for every teamfight and god pick. Wards help with this a lot as you can track the enemy jungler and have a decent idea of where they are. If they're lurking around the side of the fight clearly trying to get in on your backline, you probably need to be there ready to peel for them. Just as many teamfights are won because of a failed dive from the enemy team as are won because of a successful initial dive from your team. Starting off a fight by killing the enemy jungler takes a massive amount of stress off of your own backliners and allows them to mostly free cast for the rest of the fight. That said, if the jungler isn't really around and or your backliners have both relics up, you can dabble a little bit more in diving or engaging for the team. Be careful with how much you do this though, since as I mentioned, the divers generally have a rough time specifically because they're diving 2v3. But if you as the support are in the enemy backline, they can dive 2v2 instead, and often they will win that. It requires an immense amount of awareness on where everyone is at all times to play support optimally, but on a basic level, I would say try to be backlining and peeling a lot more than you are diving, and only dive if there's a clear opening to do so where your backline won't get immediately nuked. As I mentioned before, they can peel for each other and beat Aegis exists, so they're not necessarily going to instantly get 100-0 the second you leave them alone, but you blink ulting into the enemy backline is going to significantly increase the chances of your own backline dying in trade. Sometimes that's the correct call if you see the enemy backline out of position and can secure those kills quickly, but I would say in general you should be focused more on peeling than you are on diving as the support. That's more the solo laner's job. In terms of specific tips, my first major one is don't just use your abilities for no reason. I see this a lot on supports. The role is extremely reactive, not proactive, so you just randomly throwing out CCs on the enemy frontline is probably going to result in nothing, and a good jungle or solo on the enemy team will see that you just burnt half your cooldowns for nothing and respond with a dive onto your backliners that you can't really stop. Also, looping back to the ADC MVP point from earlier, it might seem harsh, but especially in team fights that are winding down a bit, if you have a choice between saving your mid and your ADC, save the carry. The difference between you and your ADC living and you and your mid living could be the difference between getting a Phoenix and just ending the game right there. Body blocking is also something I see severely underutilized by a lot of supports. You have a massive hitbox and are the tankiest player on the map most of the time, so just putting yourself between the carries and the enemy divers can sometimes do just as much work as your abilities would. But that's about it from me for this comprehensive team fighting guide for all roles. Do you have any extra tips I didn't mention here? Be sure to drop them below and I'll heart them if they're useful for people. Catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, good luck in your team fights, and peace out, you nerds.